The scourge of Allied vessels during the Second World War, U-boats were one of Nazi Germany's greatest weapons for stalling British and American operations in the Atlantic. They have a formidable reputation as quiet and deadly machines, excellent at harassing convoys. Although their exploits in battle are notorious, what was life like on these ships? Buckle up and prepare to dive into an ocean of knowledge on what living was like aboard a U-boat. Before leaving port to hunt enemy boats, plenty of planning had to be made beforehand, with combat patrols lasting for months at a time. The U-boats had to be loaded up with diesel, food, water, and of course, torpedoes. The busy nature of wartime Germany meant that U-boat crews were very busy indeed. So, when they had the slightest bit of free time on port, they did as all sailors do and partied as if there was no tomorrow. Because, a lot of the time, there wasn't. Although manned by fewer people than most vessels in the Kriegsmarine, U-boat crews were trained to be adaptable to all sorts of situations. Despite their small size, the Type 7 U-boat, the most produced model, was typically manned by 44 to 46 people. These included the commandant, or more commonly known as the captain, was the commanding officer of the vessel. He was responsible for strategic decision making on board. The commandant often had years of experience on U-boats and was seen as a role model and father figure for the crew, who, at the end of the war, were extraordinarily young. Crews had to be vigilant at all times to hunt for shipping or hide from enemy threats. So, other officers also helped the commandant with managing the boat. These were his two lieutenants, the first and second watch officers. These men were to take charge of the U-boat if the captain became injured or sick. They held similar responsibilities to the captain, except they often managed other areas during combat. For example, the first watch officer would manage the torpedo crew, whereas the second watch officer would manage the surface watch crew. The final officer was the Leitender Ingenieur, translating to Chief Engineer. This was one of the most, if not the most, crucial member of the U-boat. They were an excellent mechanic who often knew the components of the craft inside and out. They would be able to fix the diesel and electric engines as well as the other mechanical features of the U-boat. Next in the crew were the Chief Petty Officers, non-commissioned men who often had plenty of experience in their designated role. First was the Navigator, who mapped and assessed the path the U-boat would take along patrols. Due to the U-boats only being able to hold a small crew capacity, the Navigator also manned the ship's provisions. After this was the Boatsman, who was responsible for making sure the crew maintained discipline on long, boring voyages. Then there were two Obermachinists who managed the engines of the boat, one for the diesel engines and another for the electric engines. After the Chief Petty Officers were the regular Petty Officers, known as Unteroffizier. These included the Steuermann, who steered the boat, the torpedo man, his mate, and the other torpedo mechanic, who were in charge of maintaining the boat's torpedoes, which were often very high maintenance. The machinists who ran the engines, the quartermaster who assisted with crew discipline, and the funk personnel who managed the radios and sound equipment. Finally, the rest of the seamen on board fulfilled a variety of tasks ranging from manning the surface deck guns to assisting in the control room. U-boats often had a cook as well, whose main responsibility was to keep the sailors fed, even during combat. Not long after leaving port, being stuck in a sweaty metal box with 40 other men engaging in hard, manual labour would make the ship smell of sweat and grime. Unfortunately, keeping clean on a U-boat was a near impossible task. Most of the water was reserved only for drinking, with about 10% reserved for washing and hygiene. There were, however, basins on the U-boats, which were often connected to the saltwater system, meaning that sailors were issued special soaps that would lather in salt water, as that is the only water they were permitted to use. Deodorant was also issued to mask the smell, but there were still no proper bathing facilities, which meant that U-boat crews lived in squalor. The rationed water also meant that shaving was off limits, and crews were permitted to grow beards, giving them an almost pirates-esque appearance. Naturally, toilets were no better. Each boat had 2 toilets, meaning there were around 22 men to a lavatory. But the provisions required for long voyages meant that one toilet was often used as a food store, meaning that 44 crew had to share a single toilet. Strenuous, boring work often meant that food was one of the few flavourful things of a sailor's life. Luckily, to compensate for uncomfortable conditions, U-boat crews were given the best food rations out of all branches of the Wehrmacht. Examples of food provisions for a 12-week journey would include 494 pounds of fresh and cooked meats, 238 pounds of sausages, 4,808 pounds of tinned meat, 334 pounds of preserved fish, 3,858 pounds of potatoes, 397 pounds of dried vegetables, 3,428 pounds of other vegetables, 1,226 pounds of bread dough, 2,058 pounds of reserved bread, 463 pounds of rice and noodles, 595 pounds of fresh eggs, 917 pounds of fresh lemons, which we use to prevent scurvy, 2,365 pounds of other fruits, 551 pounds of butter and margarine, 611 pounds of soup ingredients, 408 pounds of marmalade and honey, 309 pounds of fresh and preserved cheese, 1,728 pounds of milk, 441 pounds of fruit juices, 154 pounds of coffee, 205 pounds of other drinks, 441 pounds of sugar, 132 pounds of salt, and 108 pounds of chocolate. Meals on U-boats were made to be nutritious. Breakfast usually consisted of coffee, soup, bread, and eggs. Lunch was the heartiest meal of the day, with soup, potatoes, cooked meat and vegetables being on the menu. Dinner too was pleasant, with sausages, canned meats, cheese, bread, coffee, and chocolate. There wasn't much space to put things on U-boats, so provisions were kept all around the boat. Perishable items were kept in the small fridge in the kitchen, preserved meats were kept in the gaps between torpedo tubes and in overhead storage, and bread was put by the electric motor. Food ran out quickly, and after a couple of weeks the crew were completely reliant upon preserved goods, making meals even more dull. Occasionally, when they boarded an enemy ship, they looted its food supplies as the hungry crew were desperate to get their hands on anything they could. Both officers and enlisted men had multiple uniforms for different occasions like other military branches. These consisted of the service uniform, parade dress, tropical dress, and PT gear. However, since they were completely isolated from the mainstream military, they often took liberties with the dress code. Men often wore their everyday clothes, which consisted of civilian attire such as jumpers, checkered shirts, and basically any accessory they wished to wear. As this video has explained many times, life aboard U-boats was by no means entertaining. Therefore, in order to prevent misbehaviour, crews were provided with decent entertainment. Such features included listening to records, exercise, small games such as cards, and some captains even hosted competitions on board. Life under the sea was not at all easy, and death was all too common. Of the 40,000 men that served in the U-boat service during World War II, 30,000 of them died.
It's a long way,